All right, so this online lecture is all about the history of rangeland, and we're going to tackle this in two different ways. The first way, we're going to look at just kind of a sequence of events that had happened to shape the rangeland that we have today. And then in subsequent series of online lectures, we're actually going to look at the history of rangeland management. Because management, even though it wasn't necessarily intentional, it did happen all through history to shape the land that we have today. So, you guys probably spent a lot of time in grammar school and high school learning about history, and the big reason that we teach history is so that you understand the past, so you aren't doomed to repeat the present. And that is also true in rangeland science and management because you'll see the late 1800s and early 1900s, the way that the rangeland was managed, especially here in the western U.S., was completely decimated, and that rangeland suffered greatly, and we're still trying to recover from that today. So we've got to make sure that we know the past so we don't repeat it. All right, so some objectives to make sure that you understand and have a good handle on as we work through these lectures are can you communicate the history of evolution, specifically to flora and fauna here in the U.S.? And how does climate as well as the term coevolution, which we'll define in a little bit, play into that? And then can you communicate the origin and the development of range management? And science in the U.S. as well. So, and then the last major objective is can you describe how different policies in the U.S. has actually influenced the way that land is managed, specifically here in the West. All right, so let's talk a little bit about landscape history and how it's determined. And this is really important. This has been a big jump in scientific technology in the last 70 years. So we have been able to utilize several different means of studying history of landscape. So we can look at pack rat middens, which will provide us a lot of information on the past environments, because those middens that are put together by pack rats basically are an archaeological trash pile. And so those packs of middens are really, really informative when it comes to studying the evolution of a landscape. We can also study charcoal deposits. So charcoal is primarily made up of carbon, and we have technology good enough now to do carbon dating, and so we can actually get a really good idea of how old something is, whether it's in the soil layers or in the topsoil, or even in plants plants and trees that are above ground. And then we can also study pyroliths, so fossils, and we can see quite a bit of technology associated with preserving fossils and how those different fossils actually led into the evolution of different landscapes. So, what type of flora or plants actually existed on the piece or on rangeland before, and how those plants evolved, and then where animals fell in with that as well. And then some of the best way to study human history and animal history is by teeth. So the tooth enamel that's all along our teeth actually will preserve a permanent record for the amount of radioactive carbon that is present in the atmosphere when the tooth was formed. So we actually have the ability to determine the amount of radioactive carbon or carbon-14 in the tooth, and then we can calculate the age of the tooth as well as its owner. So that's a really good way to study a lot of the fossils that we find on rangeland. So as we look at California more specifically, California has a really unique topography and geographic history. So this is a topographic map of, or a map that shows the geomorphic provinces. So these are in the boundaries of these different geological provinces are shown here by the dotted line. So we can see that the Central Valley was actually what they called the Great Valley, and parts of it actually sets below sea level. So Sacramento, a good part of Sacramento, actually sets below sea level, as does a bunch of the delta around it. And then as we look up into the kind of the hotter colors, the reds and the yellows, that is indicated of um, areas that don't have a lot of water associated with them, so those tend to be pretty high in elevation. You can see the Mojave Desert is out here as well. And then we can see the Sierra Nevada Plateau, which is covered by snow a good part of the year, and hopefully will continue to be that way. And then we can see our coastal mountains over here as well. So California, if we were to basically set it on its side and take a cross section of it, we would be looking at the northern part of California, basically going from Eureka straight across to the Nevada border, and that is what is represented up here in this top portion of this figure. So as we can see, we've got the Pacific Plate, also called the Gorda Plate, that's out here in the ocean. So the ocean actually sets on top of that, and it's constantly moving. So that's why we see a lot of earthquakes along our coastline. And so that Gorda Plate actually will decrease in elevation and as it hits landfall. And this is where we start to see the coastal mountains forming, because this Gorda Plate is actually continues to push upward as well. And so we've got our coastal range out here. Here are the Klamath Mountains. They're pretty high in elevation. And then as we move over further east of the Klamath Mountains, we've got the Cascade Mountains, like Mount Shasta, which is volcanically active. Mount Shasta is dormant. It is not extinct, just FYI. And then we've got the Modoc Plateau, which results from a lot of volcanic activity. And as we move from the Modoc Plateau east, we see a small mountain range called the Warner Mountains, and that leads into Surprise Valley and the Great Basin. A little bit further south, if we think about like basically Fort Bragg across to the Nevada line, we've still got this Pacific Plate here, and we've got the coastal range, and then we've got the Central Valley, or what they used to call the Great Valley. And then we've got a really large mountain range, the Sierra Nevadas, that get pretty high in elevation. They tend to have a lot of precipitation associated with them, and they create a really big rain shadow, which we're going to talk pretty in depth about, because that shadow that is created by the Sierra Nevada mountains here really sets a lot of the climate forecast for the Great Basin. So as the Sierra Nevada the Sierra Nevadas kind of trickle out to the east, then we've got a couple of basin and ranges that exist, and that is in the Great Basin. All right, so if we look at the Central Valley's topography, this part of California actually originated below sea level. And what ended up happening is as the plates started to shift and move around, the valley became enclosed because the coast of California actually went through an uplift. So the tectonic plates were raising the coastline up. So the original outlet of the Great Valley was actually Monterey Bay. However, after the uplift happened, that shifted it more north, so that the San Francisco Bay is now the outlet for all the water drainage coming through the Central Valley. So this happened over many, many millennia, and the Central Valley was actually filled by a lot of sediment, because water or precipitation would accumulate in the mountains. Then as we went through freezing and thawing, it would melt, run into the Great Valley here, into our river systems. And then, so this is the Sacramento River, this is the Kings River and the San Joaquin River. And what eventually happened is we got this really fertile soil that evolved because all of the sediments were running down the mountain ranges and settling into the Great Valley. One of the exceptions to this rule is the Sutter Buttes, and we can see that right here. The Sutter Buttes are an extinct volcano mountain that actually created that little mountain range, and so it is the only mountain range within the Central Valley. So it's pretty unique in that respect. And then we also have one other topographic issue to deal with as far as how California is now or drains to the Pacific Ocean now, and that is the Stockton Arch. So that actually occurs around the Stockton area, and that is where we see an upward or an upwarping of the crust beneath the delta. So we can actually see that that crust rising up because there's an arch right there. So now as we have a little bit more knowledge about California and how it actually evolved, we're going to start talking about grazing flora and fauna. So let's start with fauna because it's more fun. So fauna refers to the animals. So the grazing animal really appeared in the fossil record around the same time as the grasses started to appear. So the early grazers had cecal fermentation. So this means that fermentation didn't take place in a rumen. It actually took place in a cecum, much like the horse. And that type of digestive system is very primitive in evolution. So we see that a lot in horses, tapirs, and some camels as well. And so at the time that we saw animals starting to evolve, the grasses were also starting to evolve. So they co-evolved together. And this co-evolution eventually favored ruminants so that the cecal digestive system actually transformed into a ruminal digestive system. So co-evolution is defined as the evolution of a species in response to the characteristics of another species. So as the grasses evolved, the animals evolved as well. All right, and we'll pick up grazing flora and fauna in the next section.